I'm doing a lot of things this semester because I'm stupid. I'm also the interim chair of African Cultural Studies, so it's going to be an interesting spring for me, and the faculty director of the Center for African Studies. I'll just, before I introduce my student, Vincent Ogoti, the recipient of this year's African Studies AC Jordan Prize, I'll say that one problem that I mentioned to Aaliyah with the cake with Vincent's face was who would eat the face, right? We would have to present it to Vincent, right? So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Vincent Ogoti, the winner of the African Studies AC Jordan Prize, awarded to this year's Best Paper on Africa by a UW grad student. As I mentioned, Vincent just happens to be my advisee as well. As I mentioned last time I talked about this, I was not part of the selection committee, so this was not nepotism at all. I was, so he was the true and deserving winner. So it's a very special occasion for the center because it is our opportunity to celebrate the work of our grad students and also, you know, to remunerate them a little bit. So Vincent is, as I said, a graduate student who dissertated in African Cultural Studies, and his award-winning essay was adapted from a chapter of the dissertation that he's currently writing. In his dissertation, Vincent studies African and Caribbean historical drama, which addresses what he calls the afterlives of revolutions, rebellions, and uprisings by focusing on violence, trauma, and memory. He proposes that historical drama engenders what Michel Foucault calls heterotopias by portraying unfinished revolutions and opening up alternative sites of social and political existence that signify possible transformations, which may be conceived as the fulfillment of the revolution's promise. Taking a cue from, but also at the same time expanding Foucault, Vincent regards heterotopias as counter sites, in quotes, in which, I quote again, all the other real sites that can be found within the culture are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. Vincent understands theater as an instance of heterotopia in light of its ability to juxtapose disparate spatial configurations in a single space, even and indeed especially when these elements are incompatible. Vincent has already submitted 4 promising and fascinating draft chapters, a little on the long side, on the theater of Ebrahim Hussein, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Nishere Mugo, and Kenneth Watene. His prize, the last 3 Kenyan playwrights, as you probably know. His prize-winning essay focuses on Ebrahim Hussein's 1969 drama, Kinjeketile, about the Maji-Maji anti-colonial rebellion that took place between 1905 and 1907 in German-ruled Tanganyika, current-day Tanzania. The second and third chapters turn to Hussein's dramatic treatment of Tanzania's entangled history in 3 works published in the 1970s, also by Hussein, Mashetani, or The Devils, from 1971. My Swahili is terrible. Yogo Kizizini, The Cock in the Village, from 1976, and Ngao ya Jadi, The Shield of Tradition, 1976. The 4th chapter is a comparison of the dramatic treatment of the so-called Mau Mau Rebellion and its leader, Dedan Kimati, in Ngugi and Mugu's The Trial of Dedan Kimati, and Kenneth Watene's Dedan Kimati and My Son for My Freedom. To borrow Vincent's own words, one of his award-winning essay's main tasks is to recenter the body in artistic and scholarly representations of Maji-Maji, concentrating on Hussein's dramatization of the unbreakable or indestructible body. Vincent argues that the play foregrounds the multiple engendered ways in which colonial violence is exerted on the bodies of the colonized, and how this corporeal or bodily destruction in turn generates the desire for an indestructible body. That's the end of the description. I think you will hear much more in the next few minutes, 45 minutes or so. The title of the talk today is The Poetics of Unbreakable Bodies and Ebrahim Hussein's Kinjeketile. Please join me in giving Vincent a very warm
Thank you for your introduction. And thank you, African Studies Program, for this honor to present my work. East African Noon. And I'm grateful to all students and the faculty members who have come out today. You've supported my work, and thank you very much. So today, let's just start from those guys. So the physiognomy of unbreakable bodies, it is one of the defining imprints of superhero cultures. And even before most people started reading them in comic books, we have cases in Africa, like the guy there, Wanda Magere, comes from a community in Kenya, and he lived in, was born in 1720. It was believed that he had a body that was unbreakable. So long before even these things became common, in 1905 and 1907, the Maji Maji War in Tanzania, southern part of Tanzania, that's the map of East Africa. It has changed since then. So this was German East Africa. That region, Africans fought against German colonialism. And one of the things they did, a prophet rose who believed that if you take some water, maji in Swahili, mixed with maize flour, and you apply on the skin, it will make their bodies bulletproof. So what I want to do, looking at the history of Maji Maji and the ubiquity of indestructible bodies in contemporary cultural productions, these things, they portend an unsettling of the dichotomy between the fictive and the real, which raises fundamental questions of what makes the belief in the body's polymorphic ability, regenerative capacity, and strength to withstand bullets comprehensible. What makes the desire for unbreakable bodies in cultures with histories of oppression intelligible? So using these questions as an entry point, I use these questions to examine Ebrahim Hussein's representation of Maji Maji revolution in his drama Kinjeketile. So this is the text. As the professor mentioned, Hussein is a well-known playwright in East Africa, especially in Tanzania and in Kenya. And even here at UW-Madison, is well known. There's a fellowship named after him in African Cultural Studies. So most of his works are studied in schools across East Africa, some in German, in France, but he has not been given the attention he deserves because most of these works are written in Swahili and only 2 have been translated to English. The play I'm talking about today is Kinjeketile. So I use the body as a category of analysis to examine the powers and poetics of knowledge production in historical theater that engages the afterlives of revolutions, rebellions, and resistance. I demonstrate how Ebrahim Hussein's Kinjeketile depicts the Maji Maji revolution as an unfinished revolution and creates a space of alternate ordering from which meaningful forms of transformation can be mounted to complete the revolution within the rubrics of decolonization in Tanzania. So the presentation examines why Maji Maji captures Tanzania's past, present, and possible futures, despite its representation in some scholarship as a failed revolution, which did not lead to any glorious transformation. So I seek to explain why Maji Maji might be a seemingly insignificant event, while nonetheless marking decolonial progress in Tanzania. I also show how centering the body in analysis of historical drama that deals with the afterlives of revolutions enables us to rediscover the potential of revolutions as markers of progress in post-colonial countries. So Maji Maji broke out in 1905 and lasted for 2 years. That was the active period of fighting in then what was called German East Africa. And it covered mostly the period, the place that is today Tanzania, but other places like Kenya, you can see the map has already changed in Uganda and Ethiopia. So it was the first revolution to mobilize diverse ethnic communities, including the Indians and Arabs from Tanzania's coastal regions. The movement materialized in resistance to German colonial violence inherent in their policies, ranging from taxes, burning, dancing, hunting, and then instigating population transfer. But then Tanzanians, nationalist historians, they prefer to argue that the movement was purely organized as a quest for freedom. So Ebrahim Hussein, his play, published in 1969 and translated to English by himself in 1971, was first performed in 1969, and it gained popularity in the 1970s, especially after the Arusha Declaration of 1967 in Tanzania. I'll talk about it much later. So the play depicts the significance of Maji Maji Revolution in a political and social evolution of the Tanzanian state as it dramatizes man's subjugation through the body and language, and reflects on how a revolution enlivens issues of violence and memory to enable society to reckon with its past, present, and future. The play's main character, Kinjeketile, so the play is named after a main character called Kinjeketile. He rose as a prophet with Maji and as a unique war medicine that came from the ancestors. Maji became a symbol of unity and technology for transforming ordinary bodies into indestructible bodies. Armed with the strength of Maji, water in English, which confers immunity from bullets, African soldiers launched an all-out war against the Germans. So the play grapples with the very idea of revolution. How does it differ from a rebellion, an insurrection, or a revolt? And how, in the context of the post-colony, especially in Tanzania, this idea resists strict classification. It questions whether we can consider a struggle that fails to materialize as freedom a revolution, or whether such a struggle must of necessity be regarded as an unfinished revolution, thus creating an urgent desire to complete the revolution. My argument is that the label of rebellion, often ascribed to Maji Maji in colonial discourses, only describes the initial struggle and overlooks the evolution of Maji Maji. Maji Maji may have begun as a necessary struggle to restore lost independence on the part of the Africans and to preserve their lives without clear conceptions of the ideas of freedom beyond the initial goal of restoration. However, without the clear conception of the ideas of freedom and the need for a body politic to guarantee the exercise of freedom. However, it was quashed by the German colonial officers before evolving into a full-blown revolution. So what I suggest is that the events characterizing Tanganyika's struggle for independence after the Second World War and the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, Zanzibar is right here, it's now part of Tanzania. So these two events that led to the unification of Tanganyika and Zanzibar to form Tanzania, they stand in a single continent, culminating in the Arusha Declaration of 1967, which angered the Ujamaa ideology, translated as familyhood or socialism, as the basis of building a new body politic, thus completing the unfinished Maji Maji revolution. So although the body as a conceptual and material object is fundamental to Maji Maji, few studies have investigated the revolution through the prism of the body as an analytical category. My work recenters the body in the study of Maji Maji to show three things. One, how Hussein's dramaturgy depicts the invention of indestructible bodies to underscore how violence as an instrument for physical and linguistic subjugation of Africans creates a desire for unbreakable bodies. 2, the ritual of technologizing ordinary bodies into unbreakable bodies reaffirms the African revolutionary spirit and commitment to preserve life. So in other words, indestructible body is an antidote to colonial violence and a technology of purification for which the eventual goal is to preserve life. 3, the superposition of the idea of indestructible bodies on two divergent poles, that is the real and the fictive, allows us to examine how Maji-Maji, the historical event, intersects with Maji-Maji, the national epic, to define modern Tanzanian state. In this iteration, Maji-Maji circulates like a revenant. It died in 1907 when the German forces defeated and lynched African soldiers, and it came back to life in the wake of Arusha Declaration when the Nationalist, a local newspaper, declared, and I quote, "Out of the ashes of Maji-Maji, a new Tanzanian nation based on Ujamaa would be built." So the question I ask is, what makes the desire for indestructible bodies in cultures with histories of oppression intelligible? And the simple answer is that when I analyze the play, what I see, that initially, the desire of the men and women of Maji-Maji was to withstand colonial violence and restore their lost independence. However, in post-independent Tanzania, the desire for indestructible bodies rested on the need for a national epic on which Tanzania was to build the nation. And this, so the chapter that covers this section of let's say I read today is organized in 5 parts, but I'll just discuss one on the bodies only, so or 2 maybe. So when the play begins, the first dialogue we have, among the first dialogue we have, it shows Africans in the process of discovering themselves, reckoning with the choice between servitude and death, and the absence of the path to redemption. The scenes reaffirm what Emerson remarked as colonization equals thingification. So the first conversation between Bibi Kitunda and Bibi Kinjeketile. So Kitunda and Kinjeketile are 2 main characters, and those are their wives. So the conversation, as you can see, Bibi Kitunda complains, and all that work for nothing. Our men work a lot, but they get nothing. We don't even have food in the house. When my husband comes back from the plantation, I have no food to give him. I have looked for roots, I couldn't get any. I have looked for cassava, I couldn't get any. And anyway, some of the roots are poisonous. Bibi Bobali's son died from eating some. Bibi Kinjeketile, in response, yes, but what can we do with such famine as this? You know, I too find it very difficult to get food. Bibi Kitunda, I know. Anyway, famine is inevitable. All the men are working in Bwanakino's plantation and not on their own. So of course, there must be famine. And Kinjeketile, what you say is true. All men are spending all their time cultivating for Bwanakino and not for themselves. So Bibi Kinjeketile is a wife of a well-known person, and people expect that she should have food, typically. But here, she complains that she doesn't have it. So what we see from this conversation alone, already you can identify 3 forms of violence that acts on the physical body, the psyche, and the social fabric of that society. So Bibi Kitunda and Bibi Kinjeketile, they're afraid of starving to death since their husbands work in plantations for a settler instead of cultivating food for their families. So the plantation economy, it profits settlers at the expense of Africans forced to abandon their farms to engage in servitude to earn enough wages for tax. So the idea is that if you can prevent Africans from working on their own farms, they would have a need to work for the settler so that they can raise money to pay the taxes. So the death of Bibi Bobali's son, if you can look at that sentence, Bibi Bobali's son died from eating some. It's just spoken as a matter of fact, as if that's something that has become common in that society and expected, no comments on it. When a person dies, you would expect to hear more things about that, but here it's spoken as a matter of fact. So then the question, if the children are dying and the people cannot procreate, how can this society defend its existence? Even in another conversation between two women, the first woman and the second woman, they talk about how many days are left before our turn to work in Guanakino's plantation is over. The second woman, 2 days to go, and then another village will relieve us. That is something to look forward to. Our men would have some rest. They really work hard. And when my husband comes back, he's so tired that he can't do a thing. The first woman, and so he doesn't turn towards you. The second woman responds, I don't mean that, but he does come back very tired. Immediately flings himself on the bed and sleeps like a log. Even if there's something to eat, he doesn't want it. So the second woman compares her husband's body to a log, that is a body that sleeps like a log and does not do anything. In short, it's like a corpse or a thing. So the idea of the body as a thing reveals how violence transforms men into what Achille Mbembe calls neuroeconomic subjects. To describe people who appear to function as humans or animals, they're expected to desire sex and have a need to reproduce, but are also absorbed by thingness. I mean, that is to say, they are subjects to others' enjoyment. And the other here is the colonizer who reaps from the labors of these neuroeconomic subjects. So this element of thingness, as an attribute of the African body, is significant in the play as it reveals how the body, and here I refer to the working body, is at the center of Africans' existence. So in other words, the thing comes alive when it's working and is sustained as long as it works. So that's why they get some breaks. So you don't die because your existence is important to the running of the plantation. So in the context of the German East African colony, the African body has no meaning beyond working. In a critique of Black Reason, Mbembe writes that, strictly speaking, within the drama of life, the body itself signifies nothing in itself. It is an interlacing, a bundle of processes that in and of themselves have no imminent or primordial meaning, end of quote. So this portrayal of the body as a log or as a corpse perhaps constitutes the reasons Africans desired unbreakable bodies. Kinjeketile the prophet wanted a body that can withstand all forms of subordination, physical and the mind as well. I mentioned that this form of violence, which subjugates Africans, also creates the condition of their emergence as a political subjects. So how does that happen? So we have a conversation between a man, and Minyapala is overseer. So the first man talks about Kitunda. Kitunda has been whipped where he works. The first man is straightened up to ease his back a little. The overseer slashed him with a whip. Kitunda wrenched the whip from the overseer, and immediately the headman was called in, who ordered Kitunda to be whipped some more. So the stage directions in the play, they describe an injured Kitunda being carried home by his fellow workers after being beaten. And his wife asks, what happened? So the first man, that's when he uses words to paint the picture on what happened. So you do not experience this action on stage, but it's described, something that has already happened, which is a strategy for Hussein for not necessarily of showing graphic violence, but using language to paint a picture of that. So the Swahili version is more revealing than the English translation in this particular section. In the Swahili version, it says, Kitunda aliinuka kunyosha mgongo, which translated, he straightened up to ease his back a little, as you can read there. So the verb aliinuka and kunyosha, they're simply translated as straightened and ease, respectively. So aliinuka tells us that what Kitunda did, and it reveals two presuppositions. So Kitunda was digging, as you would expect, working in a farm, and when he's doing this work, the overseer does not see him. He's invisible to the overseer. But the action of rising, kuinuka, made him visible. In his bent status, as long as he's doing the work, he is a laborer who is in rhythm with the rest of the workers. His individuality is inconsequential. However, once he rises to fulfill a human need, kunyosha mgongo, to ease his back, the act announces his presence. He becomes visible. This act of rising is a form of protest that must be suppressed. The overseer slashed him with a whip. So here again, now here you find the English translation is much, much better here. It says, and it's, well, not much better, but it's more violent. The English translation is more violent than Swahili. So when you read Mnyapala, akampiga kiboko in the Swahili version. So the overseer whipped him. Now compare that to what he says, the verb slash. It conjures up an image of cutting something or a person into pieces. And Kitunda wrenches the whip from the overseer, and even this one has a violent undertone compared to the word that is used in Swahili, which is simply nikikamata kiboko. So wrench signals a violent act which accentuates Kitunda's protest. The action he's doing, you can see that he's rising up for himself. So Hussein dramatizes Kitunda's pain to reaffirm that revolution often emerges from a place of pain and grief. He seems to suggest that this pain prompts individuals and groups, particularly those at the receiving end of colonialism, to rise and proclaim their existence. As Alain Badiou writes about resistance, we used not to exist, but now we exist, and we can determine the history of the country. This subjective fact is endowed with extraordinary power. The inexistence has risen. People are lying down, submissive. They are getting up, picking themselves up, and rising up. So this act of rebellion becomes a site for the previously unrepresented to emerge and proclaim their existence as subjects. And that concludes the first parts of the play. So you see that violence, which ends in a point where the Africans have become subject, a type of subject, they have become revolutionaries. So the remaining scenes of the play, beginning from the introduction of maji, that's water, they portray Africans in the process of constituting themselves into new subjects. They constitute themselves as revolutionaries. So the bodies we encounter in the early scenes of the play, they are starved, beaten, raped, and sexually deprived. These broken bodies cannot even agree on any timeline on what they can fight for or even how to do it. But moving forward, Kinjeketile rises up and you see people constituting themselves as revolutionaries. They are different. So what I aim to show is that contrary to discourses that advance the idea of unity as the idea that makes Kinjeketile's maji or water and the desire for indestructible bodies comprehensible, it is the inevitability of violence and the need to preserve life that makes the desire for unbreakable bodies intelligible. In Kinjeketile, preservation of life is not necessarily an act of securing freedom. If anything, it is closer to the idea of liberation, defined as the need to restore life to its pre-colonial base, than it is to gaining political freedom. So although liberation is often a prelude to freedom, it does not automatically lead to freedom. In their book, Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century, Grace Boggs and James Boggs, they argue that rebellion aims at liberation from what issue? From the issue that oppresses people, while a revolution goes beyond liberation to involve, I quote them, a projection of man and women into the future. So for Other scholars like Anna Arendt, writing about American and French Revolution, she argued that a revolution not only centers freedom as an end, but also seeks to establish institutions to safeguard or guarantee freedom. So Maji Maji is often discussed in academic literature as a rebellion, meaning it was a war which the German colonial officers crushed Africans because they were fighting against facts. But what I suggest is that Kinjeketile introduces a discourse that reveals Maji Maji's preoccupation with both liberation and freedom. But in order to see this, that's why we bring the body to look at how is the individual body conceptualized within the play, and how does it, how do the ideas of body politics come in, especially after people are beaten, they've been defeated, they've realized that their bodies are not bulletproof. Then they sit down to rethink this whole idea. Yeah. So that's partly what I hope to show. So there are at least two types of discourses that address the intelligibility of indestructible bodies, and they all hinge on the critical role Kinjeketile's Maji, or water, plays in this resistance. So these discourses, they prop the foundational role of Maji in mobilizing or uniting people to fight against German rule. So whereas these discourses privilege the why question, preferring to examine the reasons for revolution instead of how it occurred, the play offers opportunities to examine the how question of the revolution, so that you can observe people in their lived life and see what they did and how they went around about the revolution. So even though Hussein, like many other people, it draws from the materials from the archive, which appear to valorize the ideological use of Maji as an instrument of unity, it complicates the debates by showing us our necessity, read as the drive to preserve life and to restore lost independence, serves as one of the foundational elements that creates the need for unbreakable body. The meaning of the body in the initial struggle is confined to the natural human body. However, in subsequent sections, Kinjeketile expands these ideas of the unbreakable body to articulate a body politic such as the one established after Tanzania's independence. We must note that Hussein was writing these plays in the wake of Arusha Declaration, so it's looking back. The significance of exploring discourses about intelligibility of indestructible bodies lie in how they reveal whether Maji Maji was a revolution, meaning a war for decolonization of Tanzania and the establishment of a new body politic, or whether it was a rebellion or unfinished revolution that finds relevance in post-Arusha Tanzania, which was keen to find a story upon which they can build their revolutionary credentials. So these two discourses I talked, the first one usually associated with missionaries and colonial officers, always point Maji Maji to a cult or a millenarian organization, and they deny Maji Maji the status of being an organized revolution. And the second discourse is by nationalist historians who saw Maji Maji as a platform for talking about Tanzania's revolutionary credentials, and of course drumming up support for Ujamaa. So while I do not reject the idea of unity as a fundamental element of Maji Maji, I argue that Hussein's place for unity in Maji Maji, it diverges from its heightened portrayal in nationalist historiography. So what I mean, even though he reads some of the archives they do read, and is very much interested in Arusha Declaration, especially in the late 60s, his tenure did change with other plays. At this point, he's interested in it, but he also wants to critique it, which was very different from other playwrights writing in Tanzania around that time. So he presents contradictory dialogues about unity to underscore how the concept of unity is not or should not be read as an end goal of revolution. For instance, he creates characters that are constantly debating on whether unity should be a precondition to fighting the Germans or whether they needed to fight the Germans to attain unity. The ambiguities inherent in these debates, they invite us to rethink hegemonic nationalist narratives that view Maji-Maji from the exclusive standpoint of the concept of unity. While this view sits well with the concerns of Tanzania of the 1960s, which was attempting to fashion a nation out of the many tribes, it overlooks essential lessons about Maji-Maji. So the interpretation of Maji, that's water, should not be constrained to an ideological or a technological tool that you can deploy arbitrarily. It is, in its broader articulation, Maji is a catalyst of a ritual that produces unbreakable bodies for which the eventual goal is the preservation of life and the founding of a body politic to guarantee freedom. So Kinjeketile's message was this, when he was talking about, he had four messages. One, people would unite, form one body, like a human body. Two, Africans will fight and defeat the Germans. Three, ancestors have given people water, which confers power and creates indestructible bodies. Four, he was a messenger, so people should trust him on that. So when he talked about these things, he wanted Africans to take Maji, unite, train hard as soldiers, and then fight the Germans. And the order is very important. Unite, train hard, and then fight. But the people did not want this because they had faced violence, and what they lacked are superior weapons. So when he introduces water to them and he convinces them that it comes from the ancestors and it can make your body indestructible, then the question was, why even train? You have water, it makes us indestructible, then they went to fight. So his priorities and the priorities of ordinary people, they were very different. And here is what Hussein is using to talk about, did Kinjeketile have another message beyond making individual bodies indestructible? So what we have on the board is when Kinjeketile talks about being one body. And the same message was invoked by Julius Nyerere, the president of Tanzania, when he was talking about the need for Tanzania to unite. Tanzania had about 120 communities. So even though they had inherited a colonial state, they wanted to fashion a nation out of these different tribes. And reaching up to Maji-Maji was very important for Nyerere. So while the body politic language, making one body, sits well with the goals of modern Tanzanian state, which saw in Maji-Maji a great platform, and as I mentioned, it failed to convince the men and women of Maji-Maji, people who had been preparing for war from time immemorial. So whereas at the beginning of the play, people were afraid to fight against superior weapons, they now possessed a weapon of their own, an indestructible body. So they did not want to wait any longer. So this breakdown of communication between Kinjeketile and the people, it emerges from two divergent views of the goals of Maji-Maji. For the people, Maji-Maji was a war of liberation driven by necessity. They just wanted to preserve their lives. And one informant in the play says this is a struggle for the country's lost independence. Independence is framed as a time before colonialism, when they did not pay taxes, they were not flogged, they did not starve to death. And they conceived this struggle to restore this life. Where it's difficult to conclude definitively whether they did not have ideas of freedom at that point, Hussein has done has given us enough information to underscore this idea of necessity as guiding sense in the initial struggle, but which later changed to thinking beyond necessity now, when they realized that this weapon does not work, as it was mentioned. So the scholars of Maji-Maji, they do not distinguish between liberation and freedom, or rebellion and revolution. They conceptualize liberation and freedom as synonyms, and sometimes rebellion and revolution as also synonyms. And this one distorts the image of the struggle. So what I'm arguing is that Hussein wants to rehabilitate this image to reveal the contours of rebellion, especially the cold reality that the aim of revolution is freedom. Then the Maji War that was fought in 1905 to 1907 was not for freedom, but it attains the status of revolution if you can conceive it all the way up to the post-independent Tanzania, which is using this narrative to build a socialist nation. This is a conclusion. The utopianism of developing natural indestructible bodies, it trumped other significant interpretation of the concept of unbreakable bodies. However, after bloody and gruesome defeat, Kinjeketile was determined more than ever to advance the promise of a body politic, one that transcends individual bodies. And Hussein is keen to demonstrate that even though Maji entered the colonial lexicon as a rebellion, owing to its colonial obstinacy not to recognize it as a revolution, the desire for liberation and the need to establish a body politic to guarantee freedom did not disappear. On the contrary, Maji is portrayed as an unfinished revolution. In Kinjeketile's dying words, he said, when he was asked, can you recant this word that this Maji is useless? And he did not want to do that. He said, I quote him, do you know what they would say tomorrow? He was talking to Kitunda. The officer would say that we were wrong. They would tell our children that we were wrong in fighting him. He would tell that to our children, Kitunda, that to fight him was wrong, that to fight for one's country is wrong. So Kinjeketile resolved to deploy his body as the ultimate weapon, and with his execution, he became a martyr. In the last scene, the officers tortured him so that he can say Maji was a lie. He refused. He feared that the moment he retracts his words, the people in the north, south, east, and west will stop fighting. He clung to Maji as a unifying force that would eventually lead people to freedom, and chose his own death and that of the soldiers whom his confession would have spared. Kinjeketile looked into the future, believing that keeping the hope for a body politic alive was worth the lives of many men and women the Germans executed that day. These are then the ashes on which Tanzania wanted to create the state. So I would wish to stop there. I do more in my chapter to talk about how that state came into being, and I would love to talk more about that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Vincent, for that wonderful presentation. I think we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for Vincent. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed everything today. And it made a lot of sense coming together when we brought up that how Tanzania has this sense of unified identity that's pretty unique, that this story played into that as a national kind of anthem of that. And I was wondering if what you were saying about the unbreakable body, if anywhere deeper in your work you looked into like maybe if there's a tie between that and like Joshua conjectures.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I was just wondering if like this idea of the unbreakable body kind of also went into some themes of the Arusha Declaration, like Joshua and postcoloniality.
Some of the themes of Arusha Declaration, right? So what I do, and thank you, that's the connection I tried to make, that Julius Nyerere, when they were fighting for independence in Tanzania after the Second World War, they did not want to be associated with Maji or any forms of violence. So Nyerere wanted to appear as a non-violent, moderate leader. So it was a great strategy. He didn't even want to be associated with Mau Mau in Kenya, or he feared that the British may even do that. And and they got independence ahead of Kenya. But then, beginning from independence, Nyerere goes into all these experiments leading up to Arusha Declaration, right, in 1967. The Arusha Declaration, for those who do not know, it was a set of policies instituted by the governing party in Tanzania, called TANU, moving the country into socialism, or with Tanzanian characteristics, as Nyerere did. They called it ujamaa. He translated it to familyhood. And a local newspaper declared that what basically that declaration was that a fulfillment, that they are building a nation on the ashes of Maji Maji. But also, one thing I do is to read Nyerere's speeches that he gave and some of the books he wrote to see how does he think about the very idea of a body politic. And the language I find in that is the same language that Kinjeketile was using, especially after they had been defeated with the Germans. So that's how I make that connection.
Other questions or comments? Oh, yes, please.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
Vincent, really enjoyed the talk.
Thank
And you mentioned early on kind of how the Maji Maji group, which really encompass a lot of different groups along in Tanzania in the area, especially along the coast.
Yeah.
With Zanzibar, does the play touch on any of those factors as well, bringing those kind of groups within this conversation, or is it mostly focused on only African people as well? Yeah.
So there's one instance
Yeah.
when Kinjeketile now is confused, is no longer sure whether he was even talking with the ancestors. Because one message that was embedded in his speech was that Said was a sultan of Zanzibar. And as you know, there was slavery in East Africa. And around that time, what Kinjeketile thought was, what is the point of getting rid of the German if again we become under the Sultan of Zanzibar? So when I mentioned that one of his goals was trying to have a body that can guarantee freedom, meaning can withstand all forms of subordination, whether physical or the mind. So the idea was to go beyond the body that fights and wins against physical violence, because he said the Sultan was going to dominate them, their minds. So that's the instance in it. It could seem contradictory, especially when some Arabs were fighting in the same war. Yeah. But of course, I could mention that not all Africans fought against the Germans. Some of them fought for the Germans. I think I have a picture of that somewhere. Like this one, you can see. Those ones are not fighting for the Maji Maji folks. And you could say that same thing happened from other communities as well.
Thanks, Vincent. This is really great. I have two questions. One was about the name Maji Maji. Was it used during the period that the war was happening, or did it come
Thank
about
you.
later? And I'm also curious why there's
Yeah.
the reduplication of the word Maji, because in contemporary Swahili, Maji Maji means something different than just Maji. And then my other question was just about Hussein himself. I was surprised to learn from your brief bio that he was still alive, since he's been so inactive for
Yes.
so long. And
Yeah.
I wondered, I know you did some field work where you had a chance to work with some playwrights, if you have sought him out at all, or if you have any idea what he's been doing since 1988.
Yeah. So I'll start from the first one. Maji Maji was not used then, and actually some scholars argue that the colonial discourse is the one introduces this, and you can see Maji Maji, Mau Mau, even Congo had Mai Mai. So all these names, they did not use them. They mostly begin from the colonial archive. If I had time, I do deal with what colonial discourse, nationalist discourse, revisionist discourse talk about Maji Maji and how they learn from each other. So Maji Maji was probably one of those that was kept, but it was not I mean, there is evidence that this was not basically a novel idea. There was in communities in Tanzania concepts that talk about all sorts of medicine, including war medicine, and one of those was water mixed with other things to be a war medicine. So, yeah. And the second question about Hussein. So I did not talk with him, but I did talk with Kimani Njogu, who translated his other play at the Age of Theme. So Hussein has got a unique history. He thought people do not read him as intended, especially in Kenya, where most of his books were published in Kenya, very popular there. He didn't think people were reading him correctly. I think one of some of the early scholars who read him, they read him from a Marxist lens, and one of them actually did a dissertation here. Philip, I think, Philipson something. Forgotten the other.
That's the person who gave us the money for the Ebrahim Hussein Award.
You say that? Excellent. So he was, I think, probably among the first, not probably among, Joachim Fieberg from Germany probably was the first Westerner to read Hussein. So he was one of those. And there's another one in France, Alain Ricard. So what they say is that Hussein is misunderstood, misinterpreted in East Africa. People don't get his plays. And his work can be very difficult. His use of Swahili language, even among the so-called native speakers, they struggle to understand him. So, which can explain why you don't see many people reading him. Yeah.
Kind of connected to that, I'm curious about this approach of textual analysis of the play when there are so many meanings that can come about in live performance versus on the page, and if your analysis is kind of making you inclined to direct or just get into the performance aspects of this play.
Thank you for that. It's good. So that's always been the debate between performance and the play as a text in itself. So what I usually try to do, a lot of speculation on how can this appear on stage. And that's where actually the strength for the analysis comes in, because you have to visualize this body on stage. But I don't have much to work with that except the photos of when the performance happened, so then you can see that there's no video. There are other subsequent performances, but I have not found one that is good enough that I can talk from that point. It's not like Ngugi wa Thiong'o's plays, which have been performed multiple times. Yeah. But I'm always looking for those clues to see how can this always appear on stage. Yeah.
Rachel and then.
Thank you.
You have me looking at Kinjeketile and other works by Ebrahim Hussein with a new right or something like that. I have many comments, but just one, because I'm interested in the translation. And you say that you sort of felt like the English translation sounded so brutal. And I don't think so. First of all, because whip, the verb in some contexts can be the synonym for slash. And then I think of the Swahili word for whip, which is kiboko, which can also mean the hippo. And thinking about these whips, they were quite heavy whips that were made from either the hippo or the rhino hides. And they didn't just leave words. I think they sometimes slashed. So when they say slashed with a whip, I think they're just trying to paint it as it was. So be comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Can I just add a question to that? I missed it if you told us, did Hussein translate this himself or was someone else?
Yes, it is actually a subject of so many thesis on the translation part of it. The Swahili version and the English version, there are people who have written that these are two plays, basically.
Yeah.
So, and it would be very interesting if somebody else takes up the project again to see when they, because this is a product that is supposed to appear on stage. So for theater, we care about performance, of course, right? Not usually the text in itself. But when you find some of these languages that can help you visualize some kind of ideas differently, then that's why I spotlighted that. Yeah.
I'm going to add just a little bit of context to the word for whip. In Mozambique, it's shamboko. And as you said, it's from the tail of the hippo, right? And it's incredibly tough. And you use that word, and it's associated with colonial punishment, colonial violence, and as you said, slashing of the body. So maybe there's already, the word has a specific meaning, but then the historical resonance of it does bring in the violence that, he has to add another word in English, or a different word in English to bring it out. But
Yeah.
So that would be, thank you, Rich, that's nice.
Thank you. It's
And
very
there was
good.
one more question?
Yeah, I was just gonna-
That would be the last one.
Okay, if no one else has one, I was just gonna re-ask mine, Vincent, because I think like you're helping me to think about something. So like the language of the Arusha Declaration, like Joshua, hardworking, and like Karachi Nyonyaji, is like it's rooted in almost the way I've read it and seen it in history in my own work is like this language of hard work and like a lot of sweat, but almost not as much like in thinking about like how your body's gonna feel, but fortifying your mind and motivation. Like you need to work hard for the good of this nation. And I just wonder, since you're bringing in this idea of like the unbreakable body, if maybe scholars have missed that, and there's more to like the strength that socialism is.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point. Ujamaa in itself was not without criticism, It borders on violence in itself. If you look at some of the policies of villagization, or other books written by Euphrates Keslahavi, for example, Gamba La Nyoka, especially, where they force people into villages and they beat them, basically. And they organize you to work so that you can feed yourself. So I can see that, how that can be read in relation to what was happening in Tanganyika. Of course, with the disclaimer that Nyerere believed strongly that that's how you build a stronger body politic,
So, thank you all so much for breaking the elements. And